political scientists have studied different kinds of organization to provide political order. One of the many mistakes that Karl Marx and hence communism made was they correctly diagnosed the problem, which I talked about yesterday, which is that capital will replace human labour. But their solution, Karl Marx's solution, was based on a false anthropology which suggested that humans are basically nice, loving, kind, Rousseau-like individuals. And if only you could get rid of all the shackles, as Rousseau put it, mankind is everywhere in chains, and we must set him free. So the Marxists took this idea, and they said if only we could get rid of the oppressive structures, that is the state, the class structure, private property, then everything will be fine. What they forgot was that power is always there, that human beings are not naturally loving, they are animals which fight each other, compete, and you need some way of regulating that competition. And if you formally abolish the state, as communism did, something else will turn up. This, of course, is the theme of George Orwell's famous novel, Animal Farm. You will have something that comes and says, follow me, I will get rid of the state. But then something usually, and often worse, turns up. And you can see that, in fact, this is likely to be the case if you look through the history of different forms of political organization. Political scientists have different terms for this. Human beings can organize themselves in about 10 different ways. One is called aristocracy, and that means rule by the best. Plutocracy, which means rule by the richest. Oligarchy, which means rule by the few. Autocracy, which means rule by an absolute leader. Kleptocracy, which is not often noted. Kleptos means a thief, so it means rule by the thieves. A number of states around the world are just basically ruled by rulers who want to steal as much wealth as possible. And they pretend to be ruling for the nation, but they are thieves in disguise. Bureaucracy, ruled by office holders. Communism, ruled by the party. Republicanism, ruled by ordinary individuals. Monarchy, ruled by a king. And democracy, ruled by the people. Demos, people. Incidentally, they also called, read out, bureaucracy. Now, if you go briefly through the history of the main forms of political organizations before we look at the question of why democracy is in such trouble and what we can do about it, we find that in hunter-gatherer societies, and these are the ones that Marx thought were without any class, or any inequality, or any confrontation, or any form of government. But his anthropology was based on very early and inaccurate reports which suggested such societies didn't have private property or rulers of any kind. And anthropologists subsequently discovered that there was simple forms of private property, and that there were people who were recognized to be not powerful rulers because there was no way they could enforce their rule, but they led the small groups. So you would follow someone who appeared to be more knowledgeable, or give you good advice. A lot of organisations, when I ran the Department of Social Anthropology in Cambridge, I was running a hunter-gatherer group. So I had no power. I couldn't sack people, I couldn't give them jobs, I couldn't do anything. So I just had to pretend that I was wiser than they were, or that I worked harder for them. And so they would say, all right, Alan, I know you can't tell me to do that, but all right, I'll do it. So hunter-gatherer groups are like that. Some older individuals say, how about we move to the next valley? And people say, all right. So they go off. But once you start moving, you move from hunter-gatherer civilizations to civilizations where you have some wealth, where you have animals, and you have plants which you grow. Suddenly there's wealth to be distributed, and then you need power to decide who gets the wealth. And these are called big men societies in anthropology. A big man society, as you get in New Guinea famously, and South America and elsewhere, societies where if you are very talented and energetic and show some charismatic leadership, then people will give you gifts and look after your pigs for you and give you wives, and gradually you are not born, you cannot inherit it, and your wealth will disappear when you die. But briefly, you become a leader. The person with whom I work on various projects in China, I just realized as I'm saying this, is a big woman, because she, through her force of character and organizing ability, is able to galvanize all the people who are sitting in the front row here and me into doing all sorts of things. She can't order us or change our lives very much, but we admire her and think, well, it's good to be with, and I won't name names, but they know who's involved. So this is a big men, or perhaps a big woman society. And then you move from that to great civilizations. And in Mesopotamia, China, and so on, you have ancient absolute rulers. They are often divine, and they're sometimes emperors, kings, pharaohs. So you find this in the Middle East and in the Yellow River and the Indus Valley. The early civilizations, they raise taxes, they rule through absolute power. And this kind of absolutist ruler is very prevalent in the early stages of civilization, but it then comes back at various periods. And you get it, for instance, again in 18th century Europe, absolutist monarchies like Louis XIV and so on. And then, in a strange development which was unprecedented, you had in about the 6th, 7th century BC in one or two cities in the south of Greece, Greek democracy. Now, many people say, well, this is the model, the ideal of what democracy should be. But look at the Greeks. I mean, what you have to remember is that it was extraordinary, and you have great democrats and great speakers. But this was a tiny, tiny place. It's reckoned that Athens, for instance, had a population of between 250 and 300,000 people. So this, if you think of Chengdu as a population of 10 or 12 million, Athens would just fit into one suburb of Chengdu. And of those, it was only men, forget the women, forget the slaves, forget the poor, and it's reckoned that probably between 30 and 50,000 people, that is something about 1 in 10 of the Athenian population, were able to participate in democracy. So the kind of democracy you have in America or England now, where everyone, men, women, and so on have votes wasn't anything like. I expect those Greek thinkers would have thought the system we now have is completely mad. How are uneducated, poor individuals going to take rational decisions? They know nothing. How can they? So most of the great Greek thinkers would have been against modern democracy. Then you have the Roman Republic for a while, which is based on res publica, the thing was public, but that collapses into the Roman Empire. And then the Qin Emperor introduces, there were elements of it before, but the Qin Emperor in unifying China invented an entirely new form of government system which has never been known anywhere else in history and has continued to the present. You basically still live in the Qin Empire. You may think you're modern Chinese, but in many ways your political system is the Qin Emperor's system, and you have, of course, a new Qin Emperor. So basically, this is the principle of this is that the rulers are those who are most fit through education and through training to be the rulers. So the members of the party run the country as the mandarins ran it before. You then have another system called feudalism, Western feudalism, and this is a system whereby you have a ruler at the top, but he cannot rule without giving a lot of power down to the next level, and the next level, and the next level. So England and Japan are the two strong examples of one kind of feudal state, with lords going down to the local level. And then you have another system which I won't go into, which is Islamic society, where you have an association between the religious leader and the political leader. Throughout the last 500 years in the West, the idea of democracy flourished to a certain extent. It usually started, modern democracy usually started in very small places like the Italian city-states, Florence or Venice or whatever. Just a few thousand people who could all get together and make decisions on a democratic basis. Or the Dutch were another example. Or the English to a certain extent. In fact, the English are widely acknowledged to be the original stream which has led to modern democracy in the West, because being an island, you had a very balanced political system between the ruler, the crown, the king, and the people who voted money for him, the parliament. And so you could have a participation, at least of fairly wealthy males in that system. And this system continued in Britain through and grew and became more balanced and interesting through from its origins in Anglo-Saxon England through to the 19th century, and was taken to America, where it formed the basis of American democracy. It's worth remembering that democracy in the popular sense, if you say to most of you, if I asked you, when do you think true democracy in the sense that everyone over the age of 18 or 21 has a vote, most of you would say, if I said, well, when did this happen in England? Most of you would probably say, well, surely it's quite old in England. But it was only in the 1920s that women got the vote in England. So in England it's from the 1920s. In America it's only from the 1960s, when I was already at university, that blacks were given full electoral power in America. Now, alongside that kind of democracy, which is the right to vote and make decisions of that kind, there is another kind of democracy, that is rule of the people, which people often don't really realise, but is just as important. And that is what is often called civil society. And when the greatest book on democracy, written in recent times, which was called American Democracy by de Tocqueville, when he talked about democracy, he wasn't talking about voting in national or presidential elections. He was talking about civil society. And this is the idea that democracy is about ruling yourself, taking control of your own life. And this can be done at all sorts of levels, at the level of just a small group of people, you as a group here, or a university, or a town, or a religious grouping. And the idea here is that civil society, if you think of the state here as very, very powerful, and then a whole lot of single individuals down here, if you don't have a huge number of other kinds of institutions in between the state and the individual, then the state can do anything it likes. It can just pick on you and just get rid of you one by one, and you have no power against the state. But in Britain in particular, and then in America, there grew up masses of different groups, lawyers, religious people, economic people, merchants, universities and other groupings, down to lower levels, to clubs and people who met together in a drinking house, a pub. And in these lower levels, people took charge of their own lives. They decided whether they wanted to rebuild their church, or whether they wanted to build a football pitch, or whether they wanted to raise some taxes for this or that. So from very early on in England, 1,000 years ago, many, many kinds of civil society institutions grew alongside democracy. And indeed, democracy, in the sense of voting for, could not have existed without that parallel set of civil society institutions. This is one of the mistakes that many political leaders make. They seem to think that democracy is just a matter of voting, setting up mechanisms for people to vote. So it was believed that when you invade Iraq, or you invade Afghanistan, or you invade Libya, or you attack Vietnam, or whatever, all you need to do is to bring in some ballot boxes and give everyone a vote. That does nothing. The corruptions and the mafia and the power structures remain the same. And having ballot boxes does nothing at all. What you have to do is what you have to do when you lay a carpet. You're laying a good carpet in a room. You have to put an undercarpet, carpet underneath it to keep it in place and from shifting around. And if you don't do that, the top carpet will get wrinkled and broken and be no good. So, if you are going to introduce democracy, or encourage democracy, you have to build the undercarpet first, or alongside. Now, democracy as a system, with civil society worked reasonably in some ways in England over the centuries, although it wasn't full democracy, as I mentioned. And part of the reason for this was that the place was very small. When we were in our great sort of democratic parliamentary phases, for example, in the 18th century, when you had great debates in the House of Commons, you're talking of a population smaller than Chengdu, 8 million people. Even up to the First World War, you have 30–40 million people. And in a small island with that number of people, and with civil society, democracy can be believed in. You can vote for someone and feel that your vote counts and that they know who you are. And the same with the United States in the 19th century, up to the First World War. There were about 100 million people in the United States at the start of the First World War. So it's quite small. You can feel you're in control of your lives because the people are your representatives. The House of Representatives represent you. And you can feel that you have the rule of the people. Of course, not everyone likes democracies. There are many powerful groups in any democracy which want to undermine it. And it's worth remembering that the challenge to democracy, it was often, I was brought up to think that democracy was the best of all possible system, because it was the best of all possible systems, and the Greeks had followed it, and everyone loved it. It would grow and grow and grow, and conquer the world. We would spread democracy with the British Empire and the rest of it. In fact, it's worth remembering that when I was born, which I'm quite old, but wasn't that long ago, Europe was not democratic at all. There was nowhere in Europe that was democratic. France, Germany, Spain, Portugal, Greece, Eastern Europe, Russia, none of them were democratic. They were all fascist or communist. And so democracy in Europe is very recent. It's only post-Second World War. And it can swing back and forth. It only takes one election in America, possibly, to swing it this way or that. It only took a little bit in 1930s Germany to swing towards Hitler. You can get a demagogue who promises great things to people and then gets into power and abolishes human liberties or democracy overnight. So democracy is always troubled and under threat. And particularly as we move towards a situation where the scale of the units, which is why democracy is in trouble, I put the scale of the units gets bigger and bigger. If you have 40 million in England, that's one thing. If you have growing to 220 million in America, that's another thing. If you're getting to 1 billion in India or China, how are you going to have something which was invented by the Greeks for about 50,000 people? And this is why the Chinese are rightly cautious about adopting off-the-shelf, buying American Western democracy as a solution to their political problems, because it wouldn't work. You have one man, one vote, absolute power in China of the kind that we have. It doesn't work very well with us, and it would certainly not work. So you've got to think of a better system. on the other hand, we sort of feel, most of us feel that democracy is an ideal or a dream that we don't want to entirely give up. We would like to live in a world where we are free from fear and oppression, and that freedom is guaranteed by having control over our own lives. And that's why it's always nice to remember the famous remark by the man who saved democracy to a large extent in the world. Without this single individual, democracy might have disappeared entirely in the world. The man I in some ways don't admire, but in other ways do, and that was Winston Churchill, the leader of Britain. If he hadn't existed, Britain would have been defeated. Britain had been defeated, it's quite possible that America couldn't have reversed this defeat, the whole of Europe and Russia. And he, as a great Democrat and public orator, parliamentarian, said that democracy is the worst of all possible systems, except for the rest, which are even worse. So we constantly have to remember that it has many faults, and yet, what would you rather have else? Now, I think China has a pretty good system, actually, and it's not much worse and probably better for dealing with such a huge population as this. But democracy is not at all perfect. Now, what exactly, looking back over the failures of democracy over the last 30 years, what seems to have gone wrong and what can we do about it? Well, one thing is not really to understand what it's about, and the point I made about civil society. In some ways, democracy and the attempt of the West, particularly America and the British Empire, to impose democracy around the world, reminds me very much of a famous idea in anthropology, which is the idea of cargo cults. The idea of cargo cults is that if anthropologists discovered when they went to New Guinea that the native people were digging large flat spaces on the top of mountains in New Guinea, clearing all the trees and undergrowth and making this level place. And so they asked people, why are you doing this? And the people said, well, we've been watching the white people and we've discovered that what they do is they make large, flat, white space like this. And then shortly afterwards, some huge birds fly in, land. On the outside is written cargo, and out of the back of the white birds, huge amounts of very nice things. Hamburgers, McDonald's hamburgers, and television sets, and all sorts of wonderful things fall out of the back, and everyone is rich and happy. So we can see the trick is to build a nice flat landing space, and then the white birds will come. Now, politicians like George Bush Jr. and others had the same idea. Let's go and hand out all the ballot boxes and give them a short manual on the advantages of one man, one vote, and democracy will follow automatically. Of course, it didn't, and the Middle East and parts of the world are in chaos, because by abolishing a working system of political organisation without understanding what it was doing, lopping off the top, and then hoping that a ballot box would solve the problem, just caused chaos. So, what can we recommend as solutions to these problems. And here I want to just suggest one or two things. One is the first thing is on the rule of law. This is not necessarily, it's not part of democracy in itself, but it is an absolutely essential ingredient of what we mean by democracy, because democracy means freedom from fear, freedom from oppression, freedom to live our lives in a decent way without being threatened. And so Xi Jinping, last year when I was here, proclaimed that China was trying to institute and encourage the rule of law. So China is trying to pursue this like other places. Now, many people don't really know. If you talk to 99% of English people or American people and ask them what the rule of law means, they would have no idea. It's just a slogan. But in the classic accounts of it, by various political theorists, and particularly Mangal Dicey, he distinguishes two main features of the rule of law. One is that law is above politics. That is to say, when it comes to a conflict between the laws of the country and the political leaders, the laws are more powerful. The judges decide. Now this kind of confrontation is occurring in my country now, because the people who are very keen that Britain leave Europe, and the Prime Minister say that they can decide when we start the process to leave Britain, that they have the power delegated from the Queen to decide this. But someone's brought a legal challenge saying our country is ruled by Parliament, not by one individual, and they've taken it to the High Court, and the verdict was yes, Parliament decides. And it's now been taken to the Supreme Court. Now if the Supreme Court says Parliament decides, not the Prime Minister, then the rule of law states that the most powerful politician has to give in to the rule of law. Unfortunately, of course, this gets corrupted all the time. America no longer has the rule of law, it hasn't had for some time. For example, Guantanamo Bay is outside American jurisdiction. Donald Trump has said that he's going to reintroduce torture and waterboarding. The Supreme Court is a political appointment. It's appointed by the President, and he is going to appoint a Conservative if an appointment comes up. So America is dominated increasingly by politics, but it still ascribes itself to the idea of the rule of law, and in many occasions it lives up to this ideal. But that is the first part of the rule of law. And in the case of China, if Xi Jinping really means what he proclaims, it means that the Communist Party has to separate itself off from the judiciary, so you have an independent judiciary. So if he or anyone else breaks the law, they are accountable to the law. The English tradition was this, that the king was below the law. He was below God and below the law. He ruled, and that is why when one of our kings tried to become an absolute monarch, Charles I, he was beheaded. And it was the lawyers who stood up to him, first of all, and they tried him. And so our political system has that, still vestiges of that. The other meaning of the rule of law is that law governs social relations. that all disputes should be and must be settled by normal legal process. That you can't go and shoot someone. Again, America has nearly lost the rule of law because of its obsession with weapons. The American view, for many Americans, and of course Trump is going to enforce this, is that you have the right to kill anyone whenever you see them, if you suspect in any way that they are going to do you harm. So if someone comes to your door and looks threatening, or if you are a white policeman arresting a black policeman, and you suspect they are armed or something, you have the right to shoot them, kill them. Now, the rule of law says you cannot do that. In England, if someone comes into your house, if they don't actually attack you, if you left the door open and they walk in, you can't do anything. You can't touch them. There was a famous case recently of a farmer who suspected someone was going to attack his farm, and he waited with a gun, and when they came in he shot them, and he was thrown into prison. It's quite true, they were going to burgle his house, but they'd done nothing until he shot them. So basically the rule of law is that we must settle all our disputes by negotiation through ordinary processes of law. So that's the first thing you need from real democracy. The second is the growth of civil society and citizen participation. And I've talked about this perhaps enough. And again, this is a really interesting problem for China, because China has had a tradition rather like France until, I mean, it's just amazing to me that somewhere like France, until about 1900, you weren't allowed in France to gather together in a group of more than, say, 6 or 7, without the permission of the government. And this is true in China now. I think in this campus here, if you want to set up a society or a club in Sichuan University, you have to get the permission of the university authorities. And the same is true. I asked Bei how many independent television companies you have in China. You have something like 2,000 state companies, maybe more. How many independent television companies do you have in China? No one. None. If you want to set up a press, this is being published by Cambridge Rivers Press. I set this up last March. And people say, well, how did you get permission to do that, and so on? I said, well, all I did was call it Cambridge Rivers Press. I gave its address as the address of my friend Zinan Wang, 5 Canterbury Close. That's it, it's a press. You can buy and sell it. No government involved at all. So basically, what's needed, and this is very difficult in China, is to move from a world where all kinds of groupings were suspect. Quite understandable in China. China's so big. I mean, there were famous sayings, you know, the mountains are high and the emperor is far away, and so on. And of course, that was to a certain extent true, but the emperor wasn't far away. If he was the Qing emperor, he had spies in your village. And if any news of any kind of grouping or predecessors of the Falun Gong, in other words, the White Lotus or the Taiping or the Boxer, any rumour of people getting together to do something which could explode in China and lead to immense tragedy, then the emperor would be there. The Qing emperors are famous for this, but it was in some ways what you needed in a vast empire like this. Otherwise you get rebellions and constant turmoil. But this means that you really don't have a tradition in China. There was just the beginnings of it, the end of the Republic, and during the early 1920s, after the May the 4th movement and so on, you began to get civil society growing. And then, after the beginnings of the Japanese War and so on, it all disappeared, and of course Chairman Mao was totally against this. Absolutely. Communism cannot stand any kinds of civil society association which put their loyalties in confrontation with the state. And fascism is the same. Fascism comes from the Italian word fascisti, which means to gather together into a bundle. And the state gathers all power into itself and cannot allow any alternative. But what China has got to do is to allow flexibility and the growth of meaningful associations. Actually, I've begun to realize that this is happening in China, and whether they like it or not, the authorities cannot do anything about it. And the name of this meaningful movement is not Falun Gong, and it's not White Lotus, it is WeChat. That basically the virtual communities that the Chinese are setting up, which are so powerful and interesting, are an alternative set of civil society associations. Because here you can join with people who want to play a certain game or read a certain book or whatever. Of course it's supervised and controlled to a large extent, but you can't really control it because it's so widespread and powerful. So China is beginning to move towards civil and citizen participation. The next thing that's got to happen with constructing democracy is the control of corruption. Now, most people have no idea of what corruption is. If I asked most of you to define corruption, you wouldn't be able to define it at all effectively. You'd say, well, it's a bad thing, or it's when you take money for a bribe, or when a politician. These are examples of corruption, but what does it mean? Corruptio comes from the Latin, which means decaying, or decadence, or the mixing of things. And corruption means when things which should be held apart become together. Now, in a modern, effective state, you have to separate off the economy from the political system, the political system from the social system, and the social system from the religious system. This is what we mean by modernity. Modernity consists of the separation of 4 different spheres. Corruption, in its usual thing, is when you notice that 2 of these or more of these things come together. For example, economics and family, or politics and economics. Now, the difference of the types of corruption in America and China are that in China you become politically powerful and then you make a lot of money. So you use your political power to become a millionaire. That is a form of corruption. In America it's the other way around. You become very rich, like Trump, and you then use that to get political power. So, but they're both forms of corruption. Most famously, corruption are to do with the family. For example, if Trump is doing this too. Nearly all his chief advisors now are members of his family, or close friends. So this is another form of corruption. So, what do you do about such kinds of corruption. I mean, you need to remember that everyone is against corruption, but you actually need corruption. You have to have a certain amount of corruption. For example, people often think of guanxi as a form of corruption, but China wouldn't work without guanxi at all. And how could you possibly have a place like this without particularly favouring and trusting and having reciprocal relations with other people? And so in every society you have friends or buddies or whatever who you trust and who you give favours to and they give favours to you back. So the black economy, as it's sometimes called, and minor corruption, is the oil which lubricates political systems, and so you have to have a little bit of this. But how do you deal with it? Well, there are several known cures. One is to pay everyone enough so that they don't have to engage in petty corruption. China is deeply corrupt in one sense, in that almost everyone, your university professors, all the policemen you meet, all the teachers, everyone in every position has to be corrupt because they cannot earn enough from their jobs. Almost, I mean, when we got some figures from people in Beijing recently, university lecturer a few years ago, a friend of ours, getting 6,000 RMB a month. Now that wouldn't pay for his car and petrol in Beijing, let alone his flat, let alone his children's education. He was being paid the same as a policeman. Same with the policeman. You can't live in Beijing on 6,000 RMB a month. So everyone has to use their position to get money from somewhere else. This is a difficulty you face in almost all developing countries. It's very widespread in India. Everyone is corrupt, more or less, because you have to be. You have to have 3 or 4 jobs, you have to get bribes, you have to... the only way to deal with that is gradually, which is, I think, will happen in China, to pay judges and policemen and civil servants and academics and everyone else, professionals. This came up with medicine yesterday. Doctors in China, probably in state hospitals, don't get enough to live on, so they have to earn money from corruption, in other words, to use their skills outside the system. So the second medicine for corruption is transparency and accountability. Basically, you have to, which is what Xi Jinping is trying to do with all his anti-corruption moves, to try and make people accountable, investigate them, and so on. Now this is obviously one tool. You have to be very careful with it, though, because there is always the suspicion that if you're constantly picking on senior officials and others and taking them to court and throwing them into the prison for corruption, this becomes a political tool. You're getting rid of your rivals. So you have to be quite careful of that. And also it leads to permanent insecurity. If people in jobs constantly feel if they make a mistake, they're going to be thrown into jail for corruption, you need some personal freedom and not to be worrying all the time about being threatened with trials. Finally, the last feature I'll mention is what I call the Geogenius of Scale. This is taken from, this is a phrase which I came across in another anthropologist, famous anthropologist who was head of my department until recently, Alan Macfarlane. When she was trying to explain why the University of Cambridge is so successful, she said that it was due to the genius of scale, and that is that when Cambridge University is based on colleges, and the colleges are of a certain size, 300-400 people, and when you expand the university, you don't expand it and make it more and more amorphous and individualistic. You just build another college. And so the unit in which people have their social and intellectual life remains the same size. Human beings, on the whole, tend to work very well if they live within a group where they know people and they know their faces and they become friends and so on. So a college of 300 or 400 people, or a village of 300 or 400 people, a neighbourhood. And therefore, what needs to happen is to make such units effective. I mentioned this in relation to medical things yesterday, community health posts. And what you therefore need to do, this is the last point, when the great economist Adam Smith wrote his companion book to The Wealth of Nations, which is called Law and Justice, he said that, and also in The Wealth of Nations, he said that the function of the state is what he called the night watchman. A night watchman is the person who, the machinery is there and just ticking over in the night, and the night watchman just goes round checking that everything is all right and there are no burglars and so on. He doesn't fiddle or do anything. He just keeps an eye on everything. That is the role of the state, Adam Smith said, in a modern economy. The state shouldn't interfere too much. But you need to take statewide decisions at the level of the state. So in China, the state, the Central Communist Party, should deal with international relations, defense, large infrastructure projects, everything that is going to affect all Chinese, national Gaokao or taxation. But then when it's something which concerns Sichuan as a county or province, then it's Sichuan that should decide. When it's to do with Chengdu town, city, the people of Chengdu should decide. At each level, down to the village, you should take the decisions that are appropriate and affect you at a village level. This is what has always happened in England. We've had a very strong county government, local government, down to the... And if you have this, then people are accountable to each other at each level. So these are a few thoughts, and I thought I would just end, since I've been talking about serious things, to show you a tiny bit, 2 last photographs of my own private world where I think the strange thoughts that I've been putting before you. And the first is where Sarah and I work, and this